Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Reading for Meaning Fluently, presented by Claire Hayes. Claire Hayes is a consultant and trainer for Read Naturally. She meets with educators nationwide to discuss reading, fluency, and the Read Naturally strategy. She coordinates and advises on professional development courses and programs to various schools and districts throughout the country. Claire also teaches in the Reading Lab at Hale Elementary School in Minneapolis, implementing the Read Naturally strategy. And she's been involved with the program since its development over 25 years ago. Claire's presentation will include time for Q&A, so please do ask your questions using the questions tool in your meeting panel. Given our time constraints today, Claire will not be able to respond to all of your questions, but we'll make an effort to get back to as many of you as possible in the coming days with email responses to those we were not able to address today. You should have all received a link to the handout for today's meeting. Claire will be referring to the notes throughout her presentation. The handout is also available from the meeting panel if you'd like to download and print it out now. I think Claire is going to be mentioning a specific aspect of the presentation notes in a moment. Many of you have also asked about a recording of this webinar. We'll be recording the presentation and sending out follow-up emails with links to the recording in about 24 hours. So please look for that in your inbox. Feel free to share that recording with anyone at your school or district who you think would benefit from this very valuable information. Also, at the end of our session, you'll be asked to provide us with feedback about today's webinar via a very short survey. If you could, please respond to the survey so we can continue to improve the webinar experience for all of you in the future. And finally, if you are having technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support. Their phone number is listed at the bottom of the meeting panel. And now, without further delay, I'm going to pass the microphone off to Claire Hayes, your presenter for today's Read Naturally webinar.
Well, thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you to each of you that's out there listening today. I know how busy your day is. I know all the different things that you are expected to be doing, and it really says a lot about you as educators that you are willing to take some of your time today to learn about something that hopefully will help some of your students. Ben mentioned the handouts, and I would like to mention something very specifically in the handouts. It's a rather large document. I'm sure many of you decided not to print it out, and that is just fine. There is a page on there that is essential for our interactive portion of the presentation. When there's about 20, 30 minutes left in the presentation, we have an opportunity to actually walk through the steps of the strategy so you can get a really good idea of how the program works and why. And for that portion, in order for you to get the full understanding of the program, it's great to participate in that activity. And so in order to participate in that activity, you would need to have page number 11 from your packet. Page number 11 at the bottom of the page, but if you're printing, you'll go to your file print, hit print, and you're going to print page number 13 of the entire packet because some of the pages, the first couple pages aren't actually numbered. So you want to print page number 13. It's a passage from one of our levels, and then set that aside for when we get to the interactive portion. Okay, that would be wonderful if you could have that handy for that portion. What we're going to do today, real briefly, we're going to talk about fluency first, the importance of fluency. I know you all probably know quite a bit about it, so we're just going to really briefly cover that and lay some common terminology so that we are all on the same page with that. We'll talk about how you identify different students that might have issues with fluency. It might be a good candidate for an intervention like the one we're going to talk about. Then we're going to talk about the 3 research-based strategies that make the Read Naturally strategy, and we'll go over what those 3 strategies are and how they are applied. Then we'll talk briefly about how to set up a system like this, and then we'll do the interactive portion that you'll need that handout printed for. And again, that's page number 13 for those of you who are just joining us. Please be sure to print out of the packet page number 13 for the interactive portion. So as you all know, there's 5 key components of teaching reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. The program that Read Naturally is our flagship program, focuses primarily on fluency and comprehension, although there are supports for vocabulary, a number of different components for vocabulary as well as phonics. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If you would, for me, picture a student that you have that you're working with now, or maybe that you've worked with in the past, that struggles with reading, that is a non-fluent reader. And turn on that audio portion in your brain and listen to him read. What are some of the things that you hear when you're listening to him? Some of the things that my first thought, actually, every time I listen is how painful it is for that student. How painful it is for me to listen to, and knowing how painful it is for him. Some of the terms that come to mind for people is it's halting, it's slow, it's word by word, they ignore punctuation, they make a lot of errors. Many of you probably know there's a problem after listening to your student read for maybe only 10 seconds. It's that immediate that we know that there's a problem. A student's fluency is a combination of accuracy, rate, and expression. It is not speed reading. There needs to be good expression and prosody. There needs to be accuracy and rate. And the ultimate goal is comprehension. And so you always want to be checking for comprehension whenever you're working with fluency. And we'll talk about ways to do that in this strategy, but that's absolutely essential. You don't want to get students to a point where they're not comprehending what they're reading. So you will need to make sure that that is a big portion of any type of fluency program that you're working with. The reason we care so much about fluency is because the research for decades now has told us that oral reading fluency is incredibly highly correlated with comprehension. This is a particular study done on a group of special education students, and it looked at validity coefficients. And if you know anything about this, what we consider to be highly correlated is 0.6 and above is considered highly correlated. And this is testing students on how they did compared to how they performed on standardized comprehension tests. And so oral retell and close, you know, the fill in the blank for question answering, and question answering are 0.7 to 0.82, which is considered highly valid. You know, it's very closely correlated. Oral reading fluency was even more highly correlated, at a rate of 0.91. And this is just one study, but if you were to look out there, and many of you probably have, you'll see that this is representative of much of the data that they found over the past decade or so. So we know it's incredibly highly correlated with comprehension, which is why we care so much about it, and why it's so essential. Is for many, many students, it's the most highly correlated predictor for us. What I want to demonstrate for you now is how fluent and how automatic you are with reading. So if you would, please, we're going to read these words, and I want you to do it orally. When we work on fluency, we always work on it orally, so I'd like you to read this orally. And I want you to read the words that you see on your screen, beginning just like you would if you were reading a book in the upper left-hand corner, and read it as accurately and as quickly as you can. Please begin. Okay, great. You can stop there. They're easy words, right? These are some of the very first words you learned how to read. Now what I want you to do is not read the word, but rather name the color that the word is written in. And again, begin in the upper left-hand corner and do so as accurately and rapidly as you can. Please begin. So what's happening out there? My guess is that a number of you are struggling with this portion, even though knowing your colors was a skill you learned long before you learned how to read them. In fact, I have a little 2-year-old at home who would be better at this than you would be, because she knows her colors, but she can't even begin to read yet. And so to her, what she sees is color. But what has happened to you is you have become such a proficient reader that you can't stop your brain. You're having this internal fight to try to tell yourself to not read. It's why graffiti offends us, because we can't help but read it. You might read the back of your Cheerios box over and over again, not because you care what it says, but just because it's there. And what a professor at the University of Minnesota found way back in, I think, the late 70s was he put forth a theory called the Automaticity theory. And that theory simply states that in order to do two things at once well, you had to be proficient at one of them. And reading is multitasking, isn't it? We're decoding, we're saying words, and then we're connecting meaning to those words and to other words and to different subjects, and so we need to be automatic with the decoding and with the saying of the words in order for us to have enough mental energy to understand those words. And so that is how, why it's so highly correlated. I'm sure many of you do some sort of benchmark assessment, a DIBELS or Ames Web, to identify which of your students have fluency issues. And so for those of you, this is a table that may look very familiar. A couple things I want you to notice about this table. This table, first off, is used as Hasbrook-Tyndall Oral Reading Fluency Norms Table, and it's used to identify which students need help with fluency. And so any student, Read Naturally says, any student that's reading 10 or more words below the 50th percentile is a very good candidate for a fluency intervention. That does not mean that your district says that, and so obviously you're going to have to follow whatever your district or school's guidelines are on that. But what I want you to take a look at for a moment is the second grade 50th percentile in the fall, winter, and spring. And then take a look at in the 90th percentile for the same grade, fall, winter, spring, and in the 10th fall, winter, spring. What do you notice about those three numbers as you go from the fall, winter to spring? They always get bigger, right? So even at the 10th percentile, the students are getting better. And at the 90th percentile, the students are getting better, which maybe for some of us, that's a relief at work with those students who really struggle, like they're getting better. But I want you to take a look at the students in the 75th percentile in the fall of the year. They're reading 79 words correctly in a minute. At the 25th percentile in the spring of that school year, they're only reading 61 words per minute. So because everybody gets better, these students who are struggling continue to get further behind, because even though they get better, they don't get better fast enough to catch up. In fact, they get further behind. And that's kind of what the gap that I'm sure you've heard of is that increases because of that. The other thing I want you to take a look at is in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade at the 50th percentile in the spring of the year. What do you notice about those three numbers? So spring of the year, 50th percentile for the 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. They're all about the same. And that is important to know because adult proficient readers read between 150 and 200 words correctly in a minute. And it's important to know that because we don't need to push students beyond that. There's a lot of different things that you all have to work on with these students during the day, and there might be other things that are more valuable for them to work at. So once they get to that point, there's really no need to try to push them to go faster than that. Because again, this isn't about speed, this is about accuracy and prosody and a good rate. Students read, a fluent reader reads as they speak. So a fast talker is going to be a slightly faster reader, and a slower talker might be a slightly slower reader. So that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind when you're working with students too. Now we all know that students become fluent by reading, but the national panel got together with a whole group of really smart people, and they came up with this sentence back in 2000, which says that just setting aside time for independent silent reading is not sufficient. And I'm sure all of you can go, aha, of course not. It doesn't say that independent reading time isn't important. It absolutely is. But it isn't going to catch up our struggling readers, is it? If you just give them more independent reading time, it's not going to happen, because what happens to your struggling readers during independent reading time? There may be a number of different human relations issues going around as a result of their independent reading time. You might have a student who's reading a book that her buddy's reading because she wants to think that she can read the same book, but she can't even begin to read it, or maybe they pick picture books. And so oftentimes there's not actually even reading going on for those struggling readers. But let's say that there is, because I'm sure some of you are able to get them. You know, maybe you dangle candy bars in front of them, or whatever the case might be. You are able to get them to actually read during that 10 minutes of independent reading time. Let's take that example. A fluent reader in 10 minutes reads about 2,000 words, because let's assume when he's reading silently, he reads about 200 words silently. So after 10 minutes, he's read 2,000 words. Now a struggling reader, she only reads about 50 words in a minute. So after 10 minutes, she's only read 500 words. So this is equal practice time. But you can see that this is not equal practice. This is a disparity of 7,500 words over the course of just one school week, if this was the only time these two kids practiced. And so you can imagine how that plays out and why they continue to get further and further behind. We need our students that are struggling to be in the act of reading a lot more. And Read Naturally has a system for getting them to do that. Read Naturally combines teacher modeling, repeated reading, and progress monitoring into one strategy. First, we're going to talk about teacher modeling. Teacher modeling is done throughout your day, I'm sure, over and over and over again. And the way the Read Naturally strategy does it is, if you're working in the paper format, it's a voice is recorded onto an audio CD. If you're working in the computer format, it comes through the computer, the online computer program, or the site. And the rate of the reader, the student reads along with the audio support, and the rate of the reader has been researched and normed to be a rate at which a student can actually read along, and so that the student is hearing, seeing, and saying the word all at the same time. This is not listen along, this is a read along component, and that needs to happen in order for the students to make the progress that you want to see. The way that this started, actually, the woman who developed this program was getting her master's degree, and she was a special education Title I teacher, probably like many of you out there, and she had an assignment. She was told to read instructional level material in the ear of her students and have them read along with her. And I'm sure some of you are realizing the problem with that assignment, and I think that maybe the professor had been out of the classroom too long. A special education teacher, and any teacher, if she's got a group of kids, none of them often are not on the same level. So how can she read instructional level material to each student that is at a different level at the same time? So what she did was she recorded her voice onto audio cassettes, and then she would have her students read along with the cassette at a slow rate so that they could actually read along. And that's kind of where the program started. The next component is repeated reading. The national panel says that repeated reading is the best way to improve reading fluency. It's the best way to do almost anything. We just had the Super Bowl on Sunday. I bet if you ask Peyton Manning how he got so good at throwing the football, it was because he threw that football millions of times. He's thrown it over and over and over again. And that is the same with reading. If you want to master something, you need to do it over and over again. So in the Read Naturally strategy, students read the same passage over and over until they've mastered the words in that passage to the point in which they can read them when they see that word in a subsequent passage. Because really, we don't care all that much that they can get better at reading it over and over again. But what we want is for them to master those words so that when they appear in a different book, in a different subject, on a different day, they know that word now. And so that act of doing it over and over and over again is mastery learning, which again, I'm sure you do in many different ways throughout your day. The final component is progress monitoring, and this is, I think of it as a hook. This is what gets them to do it, and because some of you might be thinking, well, I can hardly get Joey to read the book one time, or the passage one time. How am I going to get him to read it over and over again? And the hook is the timer. You give a kid a timer, and all of a sudden, it's a mini video game. He wants to see that he can get better. He wants to see that he can reach his goal. He wants to get to the next level, just like they do in a video game. And it is incredibly motivating, especially for students who have struggled for a very long time, to see hard proof and that they got better. Even just after practicing one time, they'll get a little bit better, and they can see it written there in numbers, and they can see it on graphs. Students graph how far they get if they're in their paper format, or the computer graphs it for them. And so they get tangible evidence of their progress, and that is incredibly motivating. And as all of you know, if you can motivate the kid to want to do it, you know, the job is half over, because that is just a huge piece. And the progress monitoring of this program is so powerful. I've seen it myself for countless students. It's incredibly powerful to get them going and trying to do their best so that they can actually make progress rather than just being frustrated. Of course, when Candace developed this program, she had to try it out with her students, and she needed to track the progress. So what she did was she had 13 students. There were 7 special education and 5 Title I and pre-referral students. And so she split them up, and she substituted one of the stations she was using for what would become the Read Naturally strategy, but at that time it was just this combination of these 3 strategies. And she found that the average weekly gain of the group that did the Read Naturally strategy was significantly better, was 2.35 words a week average gain, whereas the other students were at 1.23. So she knew it worked, and so of course if she thought it worked, she needed to get her other students to try it as well, and it also increased the progress for those students as well. And so that was kind of the launching pad about 25 years ago when that happened, and then it started to spread. Students work through the steps of the story mostly independently. They do need teacher support at different steps. Cold timing and hot timing and to pass are when they need the teacher support. However, they do most of it independently. And this video is on our website in both the paper format as well as the computer format, so check that out. If you go under to our website and just search for videos, you will be able to find these working through a story videos, and you can see it in action. And sometimes that's a really helpful image to give you. But we're going to go through the steps of the strategy as if you were students, and so you're going to get the opportunity to kind of see how it feels, to see which steps work and why, and so you'll have a better understanding at that point. Now, in order to set something up like this, obviously students, teachers need to plan for it and set it up. Each student needs to be placed individually into this program. That's one of the reasons why it's so effective, is because each student is placed into the program using our placement procedure. If it's on the online program, they are placed based off of how they do on the placement in the computer. You can do it through the computer program. If they're on the paper format, we have what's called a placement packet, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's essential that each student is placed individually using our placement procedure, not his Fontes and Pinnell letter assignment or something like that. You really do need to do our placement, and I'll explain that why in a minute. Then you need to teach the students the steps, of course, and you need to teach them how to do them properly. As we're going through the steps that when you're going to be working through as a student with that passage, I will talk about kind of different tips and tricks to make them do the steps properly. And then, of course, you're going to monitor student performance, and you're going to see when is a student ready to move up a level. When does he need a higher goal? You need to have a good beat on how each student is doing so that you know when to adjust their goals and standards. One thing I think is the most important thing to always ask yourself as you are setting up your workstations and as you are making decisions about how to implement the program is what I am doing, is how I am setting this up, going to increase the amount of time my students are actually in the act of reading? Will it increase the number of words they get to practice reading or not? It is so important that these kids are actually reading, not talking about reading, not analyzing reading, but actually reading. And so sometimes you might decide that it is worth it. You know, it is worth that cost for whatever reason. But you always need to ask yourself that, because all of these little cuts and adjustments we make oftentimes cut out the amount of time students are actually reading it. So you want to give that a really close look. And different kids might have different options, and we'll talk about some options as we get into working through the story. But I always want to bring up that the efficiency is so essential to this program, because it really gets kids to actually read, which is what they need, is the opportunity to actually read and read properly. This is a sample story from one of our levels. I'll talk briefly about all the components that each of our stories are. First of all, we have 13 levels in our sequence series and 6 levels in our phonics series. I'll talk very briefly about that, but every story is nonfiction in every level that we have. Each level has 24 nonfiction stories. with the exception of a couple series that I'll mention at the end if there's time. But our main ones have 24 nonfiction stories. Each story has a title. There are keywords with definitions. There's a place for a prediction. There's a numbered passage. In the computer, it's not numbered because the computer helps you calculate it. But in the paper version, it's numbered so that students can quickly count how many words they've read. So each line is numbered. There's comprehension questions. On the back side of the paper or in the computer program, when you click next, the comprehension questions come up. You can see here that they vary. They're multiple choice, there's short answer. In this case, there are matching. There's also fill in the blank, there's sequencing. And as you go up in the levels, the number of questions increase as well. I mentioned that there are 24 nonfiction stories, but there's nothing magical about that number. So you can adjust students as they go. But there are 2 sections of 24 that total 24. So we recommend you give students 12 stories at a time. The computer program would automatically do that for you because it just shows the student 12 at a time. In the paper format, you would divide them up by all the odd stories in one group and all the even stories in another group, which allows for better circulation of the audio CDs because there's 2 stories on each audio CD, an odd story and an even story. And so dividing them up by odd and even allows you to have all your CDs in circulation at one time. So you can see here there's a graph in the computer program. It does the graphing for you. Students click on the words they don't know, and then they click on the last word they read, and that the computer will calculate how many words correctly they read in a minute and then graph it for them. Excuse me. In the paper version, the students have to do it for themselves. And so this is what the paper version graph looks like. I mentioned placement earlier, and as I mentioned, it is absolutely essential that students are placed using our placement procedure. And there is a placement packet, which is online, that you can do for paper version. You can also use it for the computer version. But in the online program, you can do it through the computer program and then just assign them as you go. So it's kind of it's a more seamless way to do it. But the process is the same, the stories are the same, and what you do is you estimate what level you think a student is reading at. So if you have Johnny, he's a 5th grader, you think he's probably reading at a 4th grade reading level, you would give him level 4.0 and have him read that passage, subtract how many errors he had, and then calculate his words correct per minute score. You then plug it in to this table. So since it was a placement testing level 4.0, and let's say that Johnny read 88 words correctly in a minute, so it's too easy for Johnny because he's outside of this range on the high end. So we then would go up to 4.5. In 4.5, he read 70 words in a minute, so then we know that's within this range, and we would give him that level. Johnny was a 5th grader, so we'd add 40 to give him his goal. If Johnny was a 1st through 4th grader, we would add 30 to his cold timing score on the placement, and that would be his goal, okay? The computer program, the online version will step you through this. It's more guided because it's through the computer. So the paper version is, you have to make more decisions for yourself, I guess. But you can always override the computer, and you still need to, go through the process with them in that. So as I mentioned before, some of you maybe were just logging in and didn't hear me, so I want to mention this again. There's in your handout, there's page number 13 out of the 24 pages. The bottom of the page says number 11 on it. If you could print out that page, if you don't have access to a printer, then pull it up on your screen so that you can read it well, so that it's large enough for you to read. But I do recommend printing it off if you can. Again, that's page number 13 of the packet. So if you go to File Print, you're going to print. You only need to print page number 13. The page number on the bottom of that page should say page 11. And so if you could go ahead and get that, what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through the steps of the program as if you were a student. Now you've invested all this time already, and we only have another half hour here. And we'll leave at least 10 minutes at the end for questions. So I recommend you actually walk through this activity with us, it will give you a very good understanding of the steps, how they work, why they work, what it's like to be a struggling reader. There's all sorts of benefits you're going to get from that. So I really recommend that you work through this story with me as if you were actually a student. The first thing we did with you was place you, which we just talked about. So let's pretend that we already did the placement process and you've been placed into a level. And now what you get to do, now that you've been placed and given a goal, you get to select a story. There are 24 nonfiction stories, as I mentioned. They're not ordered in any way, so the students can pick whichever one they want. They don't get to make many choices throughout the school day, so go ahead and let them pick whatever they want. And I have picked the story for you, obviously, for the purposes of this activity. And so I want you to take a look at that passage and tell me what it is you notice. Well, you can't tell me because I can't hear you, but think about what it is you notice about that passage. You probably notice that there are no vowels in the passage. This is very important that everyone hear this and understand this. All Read Naturally stories have vowels. We pulled the vowels out of this particular passage for the purposes of this activity only and for this type of audience only. We would never give this to a struggling reader, but we did this to you because we want you to go through the steps of the strategy as if you were a struggling reader, and we want you to see the power of the program and which steps are effective and how they're effective. So that is the purpose of it. Again, all Read Naturally stories have vowels, just this activity doesn't. So we selected the story, and the story that we selected for you, or that you selected, is Strength in Numbers. Okay. The next step that students work on is the keywords step. This step is important, obviously, because vocabulary is important, and also because if you think about what a student thinks is important when you give him a timer, what do you think he thinks is important about reading? What does he think we think is important about reading? He thinks we care about speed, right? And this is not about speed. And so the very first thing he does is about meaning, because when we read, we are thinking about the meaning of the words and how the words connect to each other to mean something. So the very first thing we have him do is the keyword step. I am going to be the audio support for you. In the real life, he would either have an audio CD or he'd be listening or reading along with the audio support. So I'm going to ask that you read along with me as best you can. And we're going to start right under where it says review keywords. And again, this is not a listening activity, so be like your students and actually read along orally, okay? And that is essential that you stress that to your students. This is not listening, this is reading along. So here we go. Nomadic. Nomadic means moving from one place to another instead of staying settled in the same area. Ferocious. Ferocious means wild, violent, or likely to attack. Swarm. Swarm means to move as a crowd, around or toward something. Colony. A colony is a group of the same kind of creatures living together, especially in large numbers. Okay, so now again, for anybody who missed it or is joining us late, this is page number 13 in the handout. If you go to the print, you're going to print page number 13 so that you can follow along with us and do this activity. So the next step is the prediction step. This is not a huge writing activity. This should take about 1 or 2 minutes. I ask that you jot down a quick prediction about what you think this story is going to be about. I tell my students to include at least 1 or 2 of those keywords in the prediction to give them an opportunity to use some of those words and to try to understand them well enough to use them in a prediction. Of course, predicting is a comprehension strategy. It is teaching students to prepare their minds for the information that they're going to get. It's something you do automatically, probably without even realizing it. If you're reading a newspaper article, you look at the picture, you look at the title of the article, you might read the caption under the picture, and you're preparing your mind for the information that you're about to get, so your brain knows where to put it. And that's something we need to do teach our students to do. And so you tell them, look at the picture, look at the title, read the keywords, and tell me, what do you think this story might be about? It's okay if you're wrong. Just make a guess as to what you think it's going to be about. And so that is something that should only take 1 or 2 minutes. The computer program will move them on. If you have students dilly-dallying with this step, you need to make sure to move them on. This is not intended to be something that takes a lot of time. The next step is the cold timing step. Students can time themselves. The main purpose here is motivation and to give you kind of a baseline for them to be looking at it. In the computer program, you can mandate that you are present for the cold timing, and then they need a teacher to come over and put a password in order for them to do the cold timing. While they're waiting for a teacher, a vocabulary game comes up and they can play Wordtastic in this vocabulary game that they can play until a teacher is ready. In the paper version, there isn't the automaticity of a computer that just appears games in front of you. We do have different glossaries, crossword puzzles, and that sort of thing that they can do while they're waiting. The downside of having a student do cold timing or have a teacher need to be there for cold timing is that the student can't read until you do the cold timing. And so you need to take a look at your student-teacher ratio and whether or not it's reasonable for you to do all the cold timings. You also, of course, need to take a look at your students. If you've got some first graders or, some students, there might be some students, you can probably picture them now that you are never going to be able to do their cold timing on their own. You probably can picture them. And there are other students that could do it almost right away. So you just, that's something that you need to make a decision as a team or as a teacher and to decide how to handle that. And I'm happy to talk with any of you about that down the road. So we're going to do the cold timing. When I do a cold timing, when I do any timing, I don't say to students, ready, set, go, or on your marks, get set, go. It's not a race. I put it in their hands, so I'll say to them, when I hear your voice, I'll start my timer. And so I'm going to say the same to you. And what I ask of you to do then is to read orally this passage as best you can. While you're reading, I want you to have a pencil in your hand. And I want you to underline the words that you don't know and keep reading. So if you come to a word you don't know, underline it and keep going. You don't know it if you stop, skip, or stutter on it. So if you have to skip it, or if you stop in front of it, or if you kind of stumble on it, then you need to underline that word and keep going. I want you to notice, though, how much you don't want to underline things, and how our students will feel the same way, even if they're not, they're not cheating or trying to be deceptive necessarily, but they want to give themselves the benefit of the doubt, and you will see that you want to do the same thing there, okay? But now I ask again that you do actually read orally to this so you can get the full impact of the exercise. So when I hear your voices, I will start my timer. Thank you. Stop. Okay, draw a line after the last word you think you read correctly. Take your finger and move it over to the left-hand margin where you see numbers listed. Okay? The number that you are pointing to is the number of words that have been written up until that point. So if you're pointing to number 55, the first word in is going to be 56, then 57, and so forth. So go ahead, find your number, start counting at that point, and count over to where you drew your line, and write that number on the bottom of your page right next to where it says words read. Okay? Then go back and count how many words you were willing to underline. We will count those as your errors. So take the number of errors and put it on the line at the bottom right next to where it says errors. Do the math, so subtract the number of words you read from the number of errors, and that gives you a words correct per minute score, or a cold timing score, that you are then going to graph on your graph sheet, which is I think page number 15 of the packet or 13 at the bottom of that page. But you can see, so if you did print that out, go ahead and flip to the graph and draw a line as to how far you got. And that's what students would do, is they'd color in blue how they did on their cold score. In the computer program, they would have clicked on the words that they didn't know, and the computer would have read it for them. So if they clicked on the word ferocious, ferocious would have been read, so they would have been able to know it. But the computer would have tallied that as an error. And then when the buzzer sounds in the computer, they click on the last word they read, and so then the computer can do the math for them and graph it for them. Okay. Now, students know what their goal is, because you set the goal during placement and then you adjust it as they go along. But they have the same goal for a number of stories in a row, so they know what their goal is. But I did not give you a goal. However, I did tell you that adult proficient readers read somewhere between 150 and 200 words correctly in a minute. Okay. So your goal is going to be 150 words correct in a minute. So I'm guessing that nobody got there. I don't think I've ever done it when somebody has. So that is what we want. If your students are reaching their goal in their cold timing, you got them in the wrong level or the wrong goal, or there's a problem there. You don't want them to be reaching their goal at the cold timing. You want them to have to work really hard to get to that goal. In order to do that, they have to read over and over again. So that's kind of the system here. So now the students read along with the audio support, and it's recorded 3 times. In the computer, you can have them read anywhere from 0 to 6 times. There's 3 different rates, and each time, if you just do the default, they do 3 times. Each time it gets a little bit faster, and the last one is an expressive rate. Older students are only going to need to read along once or twice. So your middle school, high school kids and adults will only need to read along once or twice. So I'm going to put you in the older students category. We're going to read along 2 times. We're only going to read along part of the passage because I want to demonstrate something for you. But it's important to know that your students will read the entire passage, however many times you set for them. So most students will read the entire passage 3 times. And older students who are reading close to grade level may only read along once or twice. But we're going to have you read along twice. I'm going to be the audio support for you. I ask that you read along with me as best you can. I want you to notice a couple things while we're doing this. First, I want you to notice how glad you are you have me, and that students who struggle with reading would feel relieved to have this support, especially if they've been struggling for a long time, that they get some help with this thing that's so hard for them. Second, I want you to realize how glad you are I'm going slowly, and how important it is that it is read slow enough for them to actually read along. Okay. And finally, I want you to notice how many words you thought you knew that you actually didn't know. So how many words that you did not underline because you thought you had it right, but you in fact didn't. And how your attention is kind of automatically drawn to them. And so it's okay that the students didn't necessarily know, because they're going to be reinforced right here, right immediately after with the read along. And so they'll be taught the proper way to read that word. So here we go. Read along with me as best you can. And we're going to start right at the top of the page, just like you did with the cold timing. So here we go. A single driver ant is not much of a threat, but as a group, driver ants are some of the most ferocious creatures in Africa. These ants work together as a colony of millions. Even an animal that is hundreds of times bigger than a single ant is no match for the colony. Driver ants swarm over their victim. They dig their strong jaws into its body. When they are finished feasting, nothing is left but bones. Okay, we'll stop right there. So I'm guessing there were some words in there that you thought you knew that you didn't know, and you'd notice them. Now we're going to do one more read along, and I want you to notice this time that I go a little bit faster, and just like the audio support will go a little bit faster each time they read along. And also, I would like you to try to add some expression. This is going to be the 3rd time you've read this story, so I'd like you to start modeling some good expression as we read this. So, okay, we're going to read right at the beginning and do the exact same portion that we did the first time. So here we go. A single driver ant is not much of a threat. But as a group, driver ants are some of the most ferocious creatures in Africa. These ants work together as a colony of millions. Even an animal that is hundreds of times bigger than a single ant is no match for the colony. Driver ants swarm over their victim. They dig their strong jaws into its body. When they are finished feasting, nothing is left but bones. Okay, great. We'll stop there. Now, students go on to the practice step. And if you have them placed right and you have their goal right, they're going to have to practice anywhere from 3 to 10 times in order to reach that goal. Okay? I'm just going to have you practice one time because I just want you to see if you get better. But your students should have to practice over and over again. If they only have to practice once, then something needs to change. They need to be in a higher level or have a higher goal. Okay? So I'm going to time you the same way I did with the cold timing. And this time, while you're reading, I want you to notice what happens when you get to the second paragraph that we did not practice together. Okay? I'm going to time you. I'm going to start you the same way as I did before, and I ask that you start reading after. So when I hear your voices, I will start my timer. Thank you. Okay, stop. Draw a line after the last word you read. Did you get better? Excellent. Now, if you think about what happened when you got to the part that we did not practice together, you probably slowed down. You lost some of your confidence. So you can see the power of teacher modeling and how helpful that is for students. But when you got to the second paragraph, it was easier than the first time you read that first paragraph. And so you can see that it transfers because some of the words appeared again in the second paragraph, and you knew those words already. And so you can see how it transfers to subsequent passages, which is, of course, what we want. So now your students, again, they would keep going until they reach their goal. You'd have to keep practicing until you get to 150. About 3 to 10 times is kind of the range you want to see for that. After they reach their goal on their own, they can answer their comprehension questions. And then the teacher needs to be present to pass them. In the paper format, we have these little red-green cards that they can flip over. Red means the teacher needs to stop, so they'll flip that over. While they're waiting for the teacher, in the computer program, the vocabulary game comes up. In the paper format, I recommend that you just have them continue practicing reading. You can have them do crosswords and that sort of thing, but I would recommend doing having them continue reading if you could do that. There's 4 criteria for passing. So the teacher needs to ensure that the student reaches the goal of words correct per minute. They need to read with proper phrasing and expression. They need to have all the comprehension questions correct, and they need to have 3 or fewer errors in order to pass. So accurate, 3 or fewer errors. Comprehension needs to be there. Good expression, and the rate in which they reach their goal, so the proper rate for that student. When they've done those 4 things, they've passed the story, and the computer will graph it in the online version, or they could graph it themselves. They graph that hot timing. Then there is a word list in the sequence series. A retell in the sequence series. And so students for 5 minutes can write in the paper version or type a retell. If there are issues with keyboarding, you can certainly have them do their written retell in a booklet. I actually, at the school at Hale that we work at, we often have students, especially at the beginning of the year, just do an oral retell and turn that step off until they're real close to grade level, because we want them to be in the act of reading as much as possible. And then once they get closer to grade level, we'll start introducing the retell. So that kind of depends on your student. In the phonic series, there is a word list, and each story is dedicated to a particular phonetic sound, and so all the words in the word list are dedicated to that phonetic sound as well, and so they get the opportunity to read all the way down the columns and across the rows, and they have to do that within a minute or 75 seconds, I think. So once they've done that, then they can go on to another story in that same level until you think they're ready for a higher goal or a higher level, and they just keep going through those steps until you're ready to move them on. Okay, so that is the end of my formal presentation, and I have my contact information up here. So if you want to contact me directly, you can certainly feel free to do so. My email is just my name, clairehayes@readnaturally.com, and there's my phone number. I hope that some of you have questions, so please, if you haven't been sending them already, please do so, and I think Ben is going to select some of those questions, and we can answer those now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Claire. Great presentation. I do have some questions here for you, and we'll cover as many of these as we can. We are scheduled to end at 12 p.m. Central, but if we go over, that's fine. People can choose to exit when they wish. Again, we're going to be recording this. Everyone will receive a link to the recording, including the questions and their responses. So the first question for you, Claire, is which format, paper or online, so presumably Read Naturally Encore or Read Naturally Live, gets better results?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. It's a good question. We don't have any hard data that shows the difference between the two that I'm aware of. I have used both of them myself. For many years, we used the paper version, and then we used the software edition, and now we use the online one. And anecdotally, I would say that they get about the same results. It's the same strategies, same stories. And so the students, you should expect to get the same sort of results. I will say that the online program can be slightly more motivating for students, and it keeps a lot prettier reports. As you can imagine, the condition of the students' reports and the data that is collected by the students as they work through the program versus the stuff that's collected in the computer. The reporting system in the computer version is so phenomenal, because you can print out reports on individual students, classes, one story, sections of stories, a whole level, and so the reporting in the online program is superior. But the nuts and bolts of it is the same, and so I do believe that the students get about the same, you should expect about the same kind of results as far as student progress is concerned. Good question.
Okay, great. The next question, actually, there are a number of questions that are a variant of this one.
Okay.
So I'll just ask the generic version of it, which is, what are the age ranges for students that use this program? Can it be used for adults? Can it be used for first-time readers, kindergartners, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So the age range is really, we say anyone reading at or below an 8th grade reading level. It can certainly be elementary school students, middle school students, high school students, adults. We're in adult literacy programs. We are in prison systems. We're in many high schools and middle schools, and of course many elementary schools. On the lower end, students need to know about 50 words in the world and have a good understanding of their beginning sounds in order to start working in the program. If you give a student our placement pack, go through the placement procedure with them, and you give them our level 1.0, which is our lowest level in the placement packet, and they score below that range. So let's say they're only able to read 25 or 20 words in a minute, and the range is 30 to 60, so they're below that range. You can still put them in the program. so long as they have a good understanding of their beginning sounds, and so long as you're working on phonics with them as well. You know, you really need to be making sure that they're getting their phonics lessons down as well. And so the phonics series is a good opportunity to give them some support for their phonics, but it wouldn't be an entire phonics program for kindergartners. So I think there are kindergartners that probably use the program, although that is going to be more of like an exceptional, like a gifted student, but most commonly we see students around midway through first grade is kind of when there's quite a number of students around midway through first grade that use the program. But kindergarten and early first grade aren't quite ready for it often. We do have a program called GATE, which stands for Group and Tutoring Edition, which is a very similar system. And it is phenomenal for your kindergartners and your first graders and even some early second graders that need more support. They need more teacher direction. But they can still benefit from all the steps and strategies that are in the Read Naturally one. I recommend looking it up. It's called GATE, Group and Tutoring Edition. We also have a program for kindergartners and preschoolers called Phonemics, which is just really, it's a phonemic awareness program. So it's not letters and words and such, it's teaching them phonemic awareness. So that's a preschool and kindergarten program that you can look up as well. So those would be better matches for those younger students.
Okay, great. Another question, actually a couple questions tied together. How frequently and for what duration of time should this program be used to yield results, and what is the expected growth rate?
Okay, the frequency of, our recommended minimum is 3 times a week for 30 minutes a time. That would be our recommended minimum. If you can give them 45 minutes 5 days a week, fabulous. That would be ideal if you could do that. More than 45 minutes for a lot of students gets tiresome because it is a very intense program. So, you know, they're actually in the act of reading. So 45 minutes is kind of, you know, about where you'd want to max out, especially for younger students. But as far as when you stop using it, you don't stop using it, and ideally anyway, until they are reading at grade level. So until they are performing, meeting their standards on their benchmarking, depending on what your district's rules are for it. But we would say until they're at least at 50th percentile when reading grade level material unpracticed. So, and an assessment if they're a fifth grader, if they're reading a fifth grade level passage, aligning with at least the 50th percentile, that would be what we would recommend, is you not exit them from the program until that time. And the last part was expected growth, and of course that is just such a huge range and a very difficult thing to pinpoint. The whole purpose of the program is that students make more than a year's gain within a year. So, you know, we see students go make 2-3 years worth of gain in 1 year. They might go through 4, 5, even 6 levels because they go up in half grade level increments. But it depends on how frequently you use it, how closely you use it to how it's intended to be used. You know, are you using it with fidelity or not? And then, of course, the biggest contributor is the student themselves. Are they at school and regularly, and what sort of learning struggles do they have, and, you know, do they have cognitive issues? So some of those factors are going to factor in, but you absolutely should be seeing, you know, 1.5 years, 2 years gain within a year at a minimum, because that's kind of the purpose of it. Next question. I hope that answered that question.
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
The next question is, how can I encourage my students to articulate with the recorded voice? And I got another question about this. This is a recorded voice. It's not a computer-generated voice. It's a voice recorded by a professional voice actor, we'll say. So it's not computer-generated. Many of them mumble along and then lack accuracy.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very common question, and I would say this is when your teaching skills come into play the most, is coercing, convincing, talking into this, making the students do this. Because, you know, you put headphones on a kid and they just want to sit and listen, or they're just going to pretend. The way that we've nipped it in the bud in the school I work in, is that number one is there can be no leniency. You have to be consistent and always do it when you see it. If you see a kid mumbling or not reading along and just listening or not articulating, you stop the recording and you make them do it over again. They won't want to do that. They are not going to like you that day. But if you do it once, sometimes some kids you need to do it 2 or 3 times too. But eventually, within a short amount of time, I've found they do start to read along because they don't want to have to keep reading along. And so that will work most of the time. And so you just have to use what you might have a couple students that certain things will motivate them more than others. I think what ends up happening is as soon as if you can get them to do it a couple times, they see the results in their practices, and they see that, oh, well, if I actually read along, it only takes me 5 practices instead of 8, or what the case is. And so they can see that once you can get them to do it a couple times. And if you get that buy-in into it, if they understand why they're doing it, and you explain to them, that this is a multi-sensory component. These are all your brain needs to hear it and say it and see it at the same time, and you need to be clear and concise with your words and articulate, explain that to them, and then be really firm about if you see them not doing it the way you want them to make them do it over again. I think you see a change in behavior pretty quickly with that.
Okay, great. Here's another one, and I think this will be our second to the last one, and then we'll wrap up. So what additional steps can I take to make sure my student is comprehending what they are reading adequately? Such an important aspect of the program is the comprehension piece.
Yeah, it really is. So there's a number of different things. I'm actually going to try to pull up a link for you. First of all of our comprehension questions are ordered in a way to aid in diagnosis of a problem. And so you will notice all number 1 questions are main idea. All number 2, I think, are detail. I might be wrong about that, but number 3, let's say, is vocabulary. Then there's inference. And so you can easily take a look at your students' comprehension graph, or they fill in which ones they got correct on the first attempt. And you can take a look at, let's say they've done 6 stories and they've missed 5 of the vocabulary, or they've missed 4 or 5 of the inference. You can get a really good idea quickly where their problems are with comprehension. So oftentimes students will do okay with some comprehension questions and then have a specific issue with another kind of question. And so that is one way to help you and find out what that is. And that's a really easy thing to identify. Yeah, there we go. This is coming out as yellow in my screen. I don't know how well you can see it. Maybe I'll try to change the color here. This is a link to our blog, I believe. No, it's under Knowledge Base. This is on our website under Knowledge Base, and then Documents and Resources. And it is comprehension strategies from a teacher. So it's I think it's 3 pages long, maybe more, maybe 5. And it talks about different strategies you can use based on which issues your students are having. So if you have a student who has an inference question problem, so he has a real hard time with inference, it gives you a list of ideas, or it gives you some ideas as to how to remedy that problem for that student. So, and again, if you have a student with vocabulary problems or a student who has problems with main idea, you can take a look at this idea document, and it gives you teaching strategies for addressing those specific problems. The one thing about comprehension I want to mention is that you want to make sure your students are comprehending before you move them on. You're going to have some kids who can read fluently but don't understand what they're reading, and you cannot move them on based on fluency if their comprehension isn't there. So you need to, let's say you have a kid who's reading beautifully and he is missing half the comprehension questions every time. That kid cannot move on. You need to probably move them down into a lower level. I would make their goal pretty easy so that they do not have to work on reaching their goal, but mandate that they practice a certain number of times, and then employ these comprehension strategies, because it's a huge disservice to move on a kid to a harder level before he can comprehend what he's reading. So you need to make sure that that comprehension piece is there before you would move up a student. That's a really great question. Thank you for that question.
Okay, and here's our final question, and then we'll wrap up. Is it necessary to complete all the stories in a level? How do you tell when to move them, especially at the phonics series?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, you absolutely do not have to complete all of the 24 stories. There's nothing magical about that number. And so as soon as you think a student is ready for harder material, you move them up. The things you're looking for is how close is their code score to their goal. You remember, the younger students, you want to have about 30 words difference between code score and goal. Older students, about 40. And so for a couple stories, if their code score is 20 words to their goal, and they do that maybe for a couple stories in a row, that's a good indication to you that they need a higher goal or a higher level. Same with practices. If they're only having to practice 2 or 3 times, they probably need something harder. And of course, their comprehension needs to be there. So they need to be scoring at least 80% in their comprehension before you'd move them up. With phonics, it is more complicated because I'm sure what you're thinking is that, or maybe what you're thinking is that if maybe she's ready from a fluency standpoint to move on, but she still doesn't know her R, she's still having trouble with her R controls, or she's still having trouble with her blends, or whichever specific issue she's having. We would still recommend moving that student up. You do not want to slow down their progress because of one specific isolated phonics problem. You still need to address that specific phonics problem, but you need to address it someplace else. So let's say you have a student who's working in blends and digraphs, and she's ready for higher level material, but she still is having trouble with a certain blend. What I would recommend doing is moving her up to that next level and taking the word lists from the level that we have, so the level 1.8 of blends, and printing off those word lists of the blends that she's having trouble with, and having her work on that right after she completes a story in the next higher level. Just have her work on that specific word list. We also have a great phonics intervention called Word Warm-Ups, which has all of these different phonics skills lessons, audio-supported lessons. Many people do Word Warm-Ups in conjunction with Read Live or Read Naturally Encore. It's a similar system. The students pick up on it quickly because of how the system works, and it's a really nice way to allow students to continue to move up from a fluency standpoint and address their specific individual phonic needs. The Word Warm-Up has individual placement so that it tells you which holes that student has, so you can place them, and then you know which blends they've mastered, which ones they haven't, and then you can pull those specific lessons so that they can remedy the specific issue that they have. But you can also do that with some of the word lists that are in the phonics series if you have those levels. But I would always try to move them up as quickly as possible because they need to catch up and get going. So as soon as you think they are ready for higher material, you should move them.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Thank you so much, Clara. Thanks for your time and your expertise. And thank you, everyone that attended today. Again, just a reminder, we will be sending out links to the recording of the webinar to everyone that registered. Feel free to share that with other people at your school or district. We have another webinar coming up on February 23rd, which will be Read Live Beyond the Basics, how to tell if students are making progress and what to do about it. We'll be sending out an email with a link to register for that presentation shortly. And feel free to register for that as well. Thanks everyone again, and if we did not answer your question during the presentation, we will try to respond to everyone that asked the question at a later time. Thanks again. Have a great day everyone. Bye-bye.